Most people think they know how the First World War began. A teenage assassin steps out of a Sarajevo crowd on the 28th of June, 1914, and fires 2 shots into an archduke's open car. The alliances lock like gears, ultimatums fly, armies mobilize, and within 5 weeks the great powers of Europe are marching into the most catastrophic war the world had ever seen. It's a clean story with a clean moral, one wrong turn by a driver, 1 bullet, and a continent stumbles blindly over the edge. And it makes for a gripping story, which is exactly why it has been taught for a century. But that story is dangerously incomplete, and it hides the strangest fact of the entire summer of 1914, a fact most textbooks never mention at all. Before the first shot of the war was fired, before a single soldier crossed a single border, the money was already running for cover. In the last week of July, 1914, the stock exchanges of the world began slamming shut. Vienna, Berlin, Paris, Street, Petersburg, one after another, until on July 31st, the London Stock Exchange closed its doors for the first time in its history, and New York followed the same day. The generals were still drafting their orders. The markets had already understood. The First World War did not begin with a bullet. Let me say that again, because it matters. The war did not begin with the bullet. The bullet detonated a machine that money had spent 40 years building, a machine made of arms contracts and railway loans, of colonial balance sheets, and a continent-wide bet that war had become impossible. What actually dragged the world into catastrophe is a longer, stranger, and far more human story than the one in your textbook. It involves a banker in Warsaw who predicted the entire war in 1898, down to the trenches and the starvation and the revolutions, and was laughed out of every war ministry in Europe. It involves an international bestseller that convinced the smartest men alive that a great war could never happen, at the very moment their governments were pricing one. It involves French billions quietly building the railways designed to carry Russian soldiers to Germany's border faster. It involves the bankers of London begging their government to stay out of a war they knew would ruin them. And it involves an American Senate committee, 20 years later, hunting the men they called merchants of death. None of this was an accident, and almost none of it fits in a story about one wrong turn in Sarajevo. So let's go back. Not to the summer of 1914, but 16 years earlier, to a book-lined study in Warsaw, where a railway financier with no military training is about to outthink every general in Europe. His name was Jan Bloch. Bloch was, on paper, the last man who should be lecturing soldiers. He was a self-made Polish banker in the Russian Empire, a Jewish outsider who had clawed his way up from a clerk's stool to become one of the great railway financiers of Eastern Europe. He built lines, floated bonds, and ran the numbers on freight and coal and men. And somewhere in those numbers, Bloch found a horror that the marshals of Haganah, their gold braid, had missed. In 1898, he published his conclusions in a monumental 6-volume study of the future of war, thousands of pages of ballistics tables, logistics arithmetic, and economic projections. His argument was simple enough to fit in a sentence and radical enough to end a century of military doctrine. Modern firepower had made the old glorious offensive a form of mass suicide. The magazine rifle, the machine gun, and quick-firing artillery meant that men advancing in the open would be cut down long before they reached the enemy. So the armies would do the only rational thing. They would dig. He worked the problem the way he would work a railway prospectus. He calculated rates of fire, the weight of a division's daily bread, the cost per day of keeping 1 million men in the field, the acreage of farmland lost when the men who plowed it were conscripted. He interviewed officers, actuaries, and grain merchants, and every column of figures pointed the same direction. A frontal assault against modern rifles, he estimated, would require the attackers to accept losses so monstrous that no army could sustain the arithmetic for long. The spade, Bloch wrote, would become as important to the soldier as the rifle. The war would freeze into entrenched siege lines. Quick victory would be impossible. And then the real war would begin, not a contest of courage, but a contest of economies, a grinding competition in which industrial nations would shovel their men, their money, and their food into the furnace for years. The end, he predicted, would not come from a decisive battle at all. It would come from famine, bankruptcy, and the collapse of the social order itself, with revolution waiting for the loser. Read that paragraph again, and then remember it was written 16 years before the trenches of the Somme, 19 years before bread riots brought down the Tsar of Russia. Bloch's book caused a sensation. It reportedly helped persuade the young Tsar Nicholas II to summon the world's first great peace conference at The Hague in 1899. And then the professionals got to work burying it. The generals dismissed him as a civilian, a banker, meddling in the affairs of soldiers, a man who understood ledgers but not glory. Offense, the doctrine said, would always find a way. A banker, they said, understands ledgers, not glory. The bayonet, one school of doctrine insisted, would always decide in the end, and armies across Europe went on training men to advance in waves against weapons Bloch had already proven would annihilate them. He spent his final years touring Europe with his charts, even funding a museum of war and peace in Switzerland to show the public what the next war would actually look like. Almost no one in uniform came. Bloch died in 1902, 12 years before history graded his homework. He scored almost perfectly, and here is the uncomfortable question that haunts this entire story. If a railway banker in Warsaw could see it coming in 1898, with nothing but public data and arithmetic, what were the men in charge of Europe looking at instead? Part of the answer is that they were reading a different book. In 1910, a British journalist named Norman Angell published The Great Illusion, and it became one of the most influential bestsellers of the age. Translated across Europe, worshipped in banking circles, discussed in every chancellery. Angell's argument was seductive, and it was economic. The great powers had become so financially intertwined, so bound together by trade, credit, and investment, that war between them could no longer pay. Conquest was pointless when wealth lived in ledgers rather than land. Victors would be ruined alongside the vanquished. Angell himself was making a subtler point, that war had become futile, not that it had become impossible. But that is not how the world read him. The elite of Europe took the Great Illusion as a sleeping pill. And you can understand why, because the numbers seem to agree. Britain and Germany were each other's largest trading partners on the continent. German ships were insured at Lloyd's of London. British breakfast tables ran on credit arrangements that looped through Hamburg and Berlin. The city of London, the beating heart of world finance, was so enmeshed with German commerce that a war between the two seemed like a bank declaring war on its own vault. Interdependence, the thinking went, had made the whole system too connected to fail. If that phrase sounds familiar, it should, and the decade before 1914 seemed to prove it again and again. In 1905, and again in 1911, Germany and France went eyeball to eyeball over Morocco. In 1908, the Balkans nearly ignited over Bosnia. In 1912 and 1913, 2 actual wars tore through the Balkan states. Each time, the markets shuddered, diplomats improvised a conference, and the crisis passed. Each survived crisis taught the system's masters the same soothing lesson that the machine always pulls back from the edge. What it was actually teaching them was how to stand closer and closer to the edge without fear. By the summer of 1914, Europe had rehearsed the brink so many times that the brink had stopped looking dangerous. Now hold that comfortable belief up against what the same governments were actually buying. Because while the salons were reading Angell, the treasuries were signing checks for the greatest arms race in human history. In 1906, Britain launched HMS Dreadnought, a battleship so revolutionary that it made every other warship on Earth obsolete overnight, including Britain's own. The result was a naval spending spiral that consumed the finances of 2 empires. Germany answered with dreadnoughts of its own. Britain answered the answer, and by 1914 Britain's naval budget had roughly doubled in a decade, while whole fleets of the new Leviathans, costing around £2 million apiece, slid down the ways at Portsmouth and Kiel. In 1909, when rumors spread that Germany was accelerating, the British public did not demand restraint. It demanded escalation, chanting a music hall slogan at the government, "We want 8 and we won't wait," and 8 more dreadnoughts were duly ordered. Germany's Navy League swelled toward 1 million members, its pamphlets warning that trade itself would die without a battle fleet to guard it. By 1914, Britain had launched roughly twice as many of the great ships as Germany, the 2 fleets glaring at each other across the North Sea, and the contest had achieved precisely nothing except to convince each empire that the other was preparing its destruction. And around that spiral grew an industry with its own appetite. Krupp in Germany, Vickers and Armstrong in Britain, Schneider in France, the private arms giants sold artillery, warships, and machine guns not only to their own governments but to rivals, to neutrals, to anyone with credit. Navy leagues and patriotic press campaigns, often friendly with the armorers, whipped publics into demanding more ships, more guns, more security. Krupp alone employed tens of thousands of workers at Essen, its cannon exported to the armies of dozens of nations, its owner a personal friend of the Kaiser. Vickers armed customers who would later be enemies. The same firms that supplied one alliance quoted prices to the other. Every new weapon on one side became the invoice for the next weapon on the other. Fear had become a business model, and business was magnificent. Then there was the quietest engine of all, the one made of French saving. After its humiliation by Germany in 1871, France had money, and Russia had men, and the alliance between them was sealed not just with treaties but with loan. Over the decades before 1914, French investors poured billions of francs into Russia, one of the largest one-way flows of capital in Europe, and much of it went into a very particular kind of asset. Railways. Not scenic railways. Strategic railways, lines running west toward the German frontier, financed with an explicit military logic, because the entire German war plan rested on one assumption, that Russia was slow. Germany, facing enemies on two fronts, planned to crush France in 6 weeks while the Russian giant was still lacing its boots, then swing east. Every kilometer of French-funded Russian track shaved hours off Russian mobilization, and every hour shaved off Russian mobilization made the German plan more desperate, more rigid, and more dependent on striking first. By the eve of the war, roughly a quarter of all French investment abroad was sunk into Russia, an entanglement so deep that French savers, hundreds of thousands of ordinary families holding Russian bonds in their bureau drawers, had a personal financial stake in the survival and strength of the Tsar's empire. And Russia was spending the money well. Its great program of rearmament promised hundreds of thousands of additional soldiers and modernized artillery, with the whole machine scheduled to reach full strength around 1917. By 1914, German generals looked at those railways and at that schedule and drew a conclusion that should chill you. If war was coming anyway, it was better now than later. It is no coincidence that in the very week of the July crisis, the president of France, Raymond Poincaré, was in Petersburg, toasting the alliance aboard a battleship while Austria's ultimatum waited in a drawer for his departure. French money, seeking a safe return, had helped build the very timetable that made the July crisis unstoppable. And so we arrive at the summer of 1914. And at the part of the story the textbooks skip, the 2 weeks in which the world's money understood the catastrophe before the world's governments did. On June 28th, the Archduke was shot, and for 3 weeks the markets barely blinked. Because everyone knew Balkan crises, there had been a dozen, and the system had absorbed them all. Then on July 23rd, Austria delivered its ultimatum to Serbia, and the smart money read the terms and understood. What followed was the fastest financial unraveling the world had ever seen. Investors everywhere tried to do the same 3 things at once: sell securities, call in foreign debts, and get gold. The global credit system, the very web of interdependence that was supposed to make war impossible, began to strangle itself. Bourses buckled under panic selling, and one by one, the exchanges of Europe closed their doors. Vienna, Brussels, Berlin, Paris, St. Petersburg. On July 31st, the unthinkable, the London Stock Exchange, the citadel of world finance, shut for the first time since its founding, and the New York Stock Exchange closed the same day, and would stay closed for months. Crowds formed outside the Bank of England, clerks and merchants queuing down Threadneedle Street to swap paper for gold sovereigns while the reserve drained by the hour. The Bank of England's rate leapt from 3% to 8%, then to 10%, a level meant for the end of the world. Lloyd's underwriters watched the ships they insured turn overnight into targets. Bills of exchange drawn on Berlin and Vienna, the ordinary plumbing of world commerce, became unpayable paper in London's hands, threatening to topple the acceptance houses that were the city's aristocracy. Britain extended its August bank holiday and declared a moratorium on debts because the entire bill market of London, the machinery that financed world trade, had simply stopped. A young Treasury advisor named John Maynard Keynes was rushed to London, riding, as the story goes, in the sidecar of his brother-in-law's motorcycle to help improvise a rescue. And here is the detail that gives the game away. The city of London, the richest square mile on earth, was desperate for peace. The great banking houses pleaded with the government that intervention in a European war would destroy trade, destroy credit, destroy everything they had built. The Rothschilds pressed for neutrality. The financiers, the supposed puppet masters of empire, discovered in the last days of July that they had no strings to pull at all. The men of money begged. The men of state went to war anyway. And while the money burned, the diplomatic machine ran through its gears with the precision of one of those French-financed timetables. Austria had secured from Berlin what historians call the blank check, unconditional backing for whatever it chose to do to Serbia. The ultimatum of July 23rd was drafted to be refused, and when Serbia accepted nearly all of it anyway, Vienna declared war regardless. Russia began to mobilize in Serbia's defense, and here the railway logic seized control, because in 1914 mobilization was not a threat, it was a countdown. The German plan required beating France before Russia was ready, which meant that once Russian reserves began boarding trains, every day of German hesitation was a day subtracted from Germany's own survival, or so its planners believed. Berlin demanded Russia stop. Russia could not stop without abandoning its ally and its credibility. Germany declared war on Russia, then on France, and struck through neutral Belgium to keep to its schedule, and the violation of Belgium gave the British cabinet the cause it needed. Not one of the men signing those declarations wanted the war they were getting. Every one of them believed the timetable left no alternative. On August 4th, Britain declared war on Germany, and the world that finance had built, the first great age of globalization, ended in an afternoon. Which brings us to the question of what everyone thought they were marching into, because the answer explains the entire shape of the war. Every government planned for a short war, home before the leaves fall, and the reasoning was explicitly economic. The experts believed no modern economy could sustain a great war for long, that credit would run out, and trade would collapse within months, and so the war would simply have to be short. They had, in other words, absorbed half of Bloch's argument, the half that said long war meant ruin, while rejecting the half that said the fighting itself would make quick victory impossible. It was the most expensive misreading in history. The armies collided, the offensives bled out exactly as Bloch's arithmetic said they would, and the trenches froze from the North Sea to Switzerland. And then, instead of stopping, the states discovered what Bloch had feared most, that a modern government could keep a ruinous war alive almost indefinitely by devouring its own future, through war bonds, through printing money, through debts that would poison the next generation. Taxes covered only a fraction of the cost. In Germany, barely more than a token of it. The rest was borrowed and inflated into existence, in an atmosphere of engineered patriotism, war bond posters on every wall. School children marched to the savings bank, church bells rung for subscription drives, an entire civilization signing over its future in weekly installments. Prices in Germany had roughly doubled by the war's midpoint and kept climbing. A quiet tax on every household that no parliament ever voted for, and the fuse of the hyperinflation to come. The direct financial cost of the war has been estimated at around $180 billion of that era's money, a sum so far beyond the world of 1,914 that it had no meaning, roughly the cost of running the pre-war British Empire for half a century. And the economic war became a weapon in itself. Britain's naval blockade slowly starved the Central Powers of food, fertilizer, and raw materials. In the German winter of 1916 to 1917, remembered as the turnip winter, civilians survived on animal feed, and hundreds of thousands of German civilians would ultimately die of malnutrition and its diseases. Bloch's famine had arrived on schedule. So had his revolutions. Bread queues in Petrograd became riots, riots became mutiny, and in 1917 the Russian monarchy collapsed exactly the way a Warsaw banker had predicted 2 decades earlier, followed within 2 years by the thrones of Germany and Austria. Now, who was to blame for all of it? That question set off a war of its own, and the fight over the answer is one of the great dramas of modern history. At Versailles in 1919, the victors wrote the answer into law. Article 231, the War Guilt Clause. Germany and its allies were responsible, full stop, and the reparations bill followed from it. Almost immediately, the revisionists pushed back, and by the 1920s the fashionable view, encouraged generously by the German government, was that no one had really been to blame, that the powers had, in Lloyd George's famous phrase, slithered over the brink into the boiling cauldron of war together. Then in the 1930s, the argument turned to follow the money. An American Senate committee under Gerald Nye spent 2 years investigating whether arms manufacturers and Wall Street lenders, the merchants of death, had dragged the United States into the war to protect their profits on their loans. The hearings were a sensation. They fed a generation's isolationism and helped produce the Neutrality Acts, and then they largely collapsed because the committee never proved the conspiracy it advertised. The bankers had profited from the war enormously, but profiting from a fire is not the same as setting it. It was a lesson in the difference between follow the money and blame the money. Following it reveals the system. Blaming it lets everyone else off the hook. The generals who worshipped the offensive, the diplomats who gambled with mobilization orders, the publics who cheered the fleets, and the voters who bought the bonds. The Nye Committee wanted a villain with a bank account. History handed it something far less comfortable, a civilization that had made war profitable to prepare for and unthinkable to imagine at the same time. Then in 1961, a German historian named Fritz Fischer detonated the debate all over again, arguing from Germany's own archives that Berlin's leaders had willed the war as a bid for world power. His colleagues called him a traitor to his nation. The West German government tried to obstruct his American lecture tour, and yet his evidence permanently ended the comfortable everyone-slithered consensus. More recently, historians like Christopher Clark have swung the pendulum back towards shared blame, painting the statesmen of 1914 as sleepwalkers, and critics have answered that sleepwalkers is far too kind a word for men who could read a mobilization table. The debate is not settled. It never will be. But notice what almost every version now concedes, that beneath the diplomacy sat a system, an economy of fear with its own momentum, and that the men of 1,914 were not blind. They were making what looked inside that system like rational choices. Now, let me bring all of these threads together, because no single villain assembled this catastrophe, and that is precisely what makes it terrifying. You had a continent whose peace rested on the theory that trade had made war unprofitable, which was true, and therefore impossible, which was fatally false. You had an arms industry for which every diplomatic crisis was a sales opportunity, feeding the fear it fed on. You had French savings quietly financing Russian railways whose military purpose was to make mobilization faster, and therefore crises shorter, and therefore war harder to stop. You had a German general staff convinced by those same railways that its window for survival was closing, and that later meant never. You had war plans on every side built around speed, in which the first nation to hesitate would be the first to lose. You had a global financial system so fragile that the mere approach of war shut every major exchange on earth before the armies even marched. You had the one man who had run the full arithmetic dead for 12 years, his warning filed away as the fantasy of a civilian. And you had governments who, when the machine finally began to turn, discovered that every lever they reached for was already connected to another country's trigger. Any one of these, Europe survives. All of them together, meshed and mutually reinforcing, turned 2 pistol shots into 20 million dead. And the number is the anesthetic. On the first day of the Battle of the Somme alone, the 1st of July 1916, the British Army suffered more than 57,000 casualties, the bloodiest single day in its history, for a few fields of churned mud. Bloch's arithmetic, item by item. The reality was a generation of young men fed into an industrial process that Bloch had described as a great machine for the manufacture of corpses, villages in France where every male name on the church wall shares a single year of death, widows in Berlin queuing for turnips in the snow, and an influenza pandemic riding home in the troop ships to kill tens of millions more, striking hardest at the same exhausted, undernourished populations the war had already hollowed out. It was millions of widows and orphans across every belligerent nation, pensions that consumed national budgets for half a century, and men who came home whole in body and shattered in mind, wandering their own kitchens at night, flinching at slammed doors, in an age that had no word yet for what the shelling had done to them, only the helpless phrase, shell shock. The war did not merely kill people. It killed the world that produced it, 4 empires, a century of global finance, and the very idea that European civilization was too advanced for self-destruction. The gold standard that had anchored the world's money since the century before went into the fire with them, suspended in that first August week and never truly whole again. The pound sterling began its long abdication. New York started its rise toward the throne of world finance, and the neat pre-war web of trade that was supposed to have made all of this impossible took decades to rebuild, and in some ways never was rebuilt. The economic aftershocks rolled on for decades, into hyperinflation in Germany, into the debt tangles of the 1920s, into the Depression, and through it, into an even darker war, which is a story we have already told on this channel. So look around, because every piece of this machine has been rebuilt with modern parts. The world's 2 largest economies are each other's greatest trading partners, their supply chains braided together down to the individual microchip, and serious people assure us, in books and columns and conference keynotes, that this makes war between them irrational and therefore unlikely. That second word is doing exactly the work it did in 1910. Arms budgets are breaking records on every continent, justified, as always, by the other side's arms budget. Financial markets are wired together more tightly than in any age since 1914. Trillions moving daily through a web everyone calls resilient, which is sold as stability right up until the moment it becomes contagion, the way it did in that last week of July, when the web itself became the rope. And somewhere, no doubt, there is a modern Jan Bloch running the arithmetic, publishing the warning, and being politely dismissed by professionals who know better. Interdependence is real. It simply is not a guarantee. It is a brake. And a brake is only as good as the driver's willingness to use it. In 1914, the drivers looked at the brake, agreed it was excellent, and reasoned that since crashing was now unthinkably expensive, they were free to race. The men who understood money best watched their impossible war arrive anyway. In the same week, their exchanges slammed shut, and the last thing the old world's bankers learned, too late to matter, was that economics can tell you a war is madness, and history will start it anyway. The next time someone tells you the First World War began because an archduke took a wrong turn in Sarajevo, you'll know better. You'll know the markets closed before the guns opened. You'll know a banker in Warsaw wrote the script in 1898 and the generals refused to read it. You'll know the money built the railways, armed the fleets, financed the fear, and then begged, too late, for the machine it had built to stop. And you'll know that the most dangerous sentence in any language is some version of, "It could never happen," because it is too expensive. If this story changed the way you see the First World War, hit that subscribe button, because this channel digs up the money buried under history's tidy stories, the debts, the deals, and the warnings nobody read. Drop a comment and tell me which failure you think truly made the war unstoppable. Bloch's ignored prophecy, the illusion that trade meant peace, the arms race, or the French loans that built Russia's railways. I read every single one. Give the video a like if you made it this far. It genuinely helps. And I'll see you in the next one.